The morning sun cast long shadows across the stone corridors of Windsor Castle as members of the royal household prepared for what seemed like an ordinary Tuesday. Staff members moved quietly through the ancient halls, their footsteps muffled by centuries-old carpets. In the East Wing, Catherine, Princess of Wales, was scheduled to attend a private meeting regarding her upcoming charity initiatives. She had been working tirelessly on programs supporting early childhood development, and today's gathering would finalize details for a major announcement. Catherine arrived precisely at 9 o'clock, dressed in a modest navy suit that reflected her preference for understated elegance. Her warm smile greeted the staff members who had gathered in the conference room. Papers were spread across the mahogany table, and everyone seemed eager to begin. The atmosphere was professional yet relaxed, exactly as Catherine preferred. She had always believed that the best work happened when people felt comfortable enough to share their honest opinions. Meanwhile, in another section of the palace, Camilla, queen consort, was dealing with frustrations of her own. Her schedule had been packed for weeks, and the constant demands of royal life were beginning to show. Those close to her had noticed a shift in her demeanor over the past few days. Small annoyances that she would normally brush aside seemed to accumulate into something heavier. Her private secretary had mentioned that morning that several engagements would need to be rescheduled, which only added to the mounting pressure. The palace corridors held secrets that day, though no one could have predicted what would unfold. Security cameras, installed years ago as part of routine safety measures, quietly recorded every movement throughout the building. These devices were meant to protect the royal family, capturing footage that would typically never see the light of day. The guards who monitored these feeds worked in a basement room, their eyes trained on multiple screens showing different angles of Palace's life. Officer James Mitchell had served the royal family for nearly 15 years. His role as a senior guard meant he understood the delicate balance between security and privacy. He knew when to look away and when to pay attention. That morning, he noticed unusual movement on one of the monitors. The timestamp read 10:47 a.m. when he saw Camilla walking briskly down a corridor that would intersect with the route Catherine would take after her meeting. Catherine's meeting was wrapping up successfully. The team had made excellent progress, and everyone felt energized about the initiatives moving forward. She gathered her notes and thanked each person individually, taking time to acknowledge their specific contributions. This personal touch was something that had endeared her to palace staff over the years. As she stepped into the hallway, she was thinking about her next appointment and didn't immediately notice the figure approaching from the opposite direction. The corridor where they met was lined with portraits of past monarchs, their painted eyes seeming to watch the scene unfold. Natural light streamed through tall windows, creating patches of brightness against the deep red carpet. Catherine looked up and saw Camilla walking toward her. Protocol dictated a polite acknowledgement, perhaps a brief conversation about their respective schedules. Both women understood the unspoken rules that govern palace interactions, but something was different that morning. Camilla's expression carried an intensity that immediately put Catherine on alert. The queen consort's pace didn't slow as she approached. Her jaw was set in a way that suggested barely contained emotion. Catherine, always gracious, prepared to greet her with the usual pleasantries. But the words caught in her throat when she saw the look in Camilla's eyes. The two women stopped a few feet apart. For a moment, silence hung between them, heavy with unspoken tensions that had been building beneath the surface of royal propriety. The palace staff members who had been walking nearby seemed to sense the atmosphere and quietly disappeared into side rooms, leaving the corridor empty except for the two women and the ever-present security cameras. Camilla spoke first, her voice low, but carrying an edge that made Catherine straighten her posture. The words were not the polite greetings expected in such encounters. Instead, they carried accusations and frustrations that had apparently been simmering for some time. She mentioned recent press coverage, the constant comparisons between herself and Catherine, the way the public seemed to favor the younger woman despite Camilla's years of service to the crown. Catherine listened, her face remaining composed even as the words grew harsher. She had been trained from the moment she joined the royal family to maintain dignity under pressure, to never show emotion that could be misconstrued or used against her. but inside her heart was racing. This was not a conversation she had anticipated or prepared for. The rational part of her mind understood that stress affected everyone differently, that the pressures of royal life could manifest in unexpected ways. The exchange continued. With Camilla's voice rising slightly, she gestured with her hands, emphasizing points about duty, respect, and the hierarchy that existed within the family. Catherine responded calmly, attempting to de-escalate the situation with measured words and a gentle tone. She suggested they might continue this conversation in a more private setting, where they could speak freely without concern for who might overhear. This suggestion seemed to have the opposite effect. Camilla's frustration intensified, and she took a step closer to Catherine. The physical proximity crossed an invisible line, transforming the encounter from a heated conversation into something more concerning. Catherine instinctively took a small step backward, her training kicking in even as she maintained her outward composure. In the security room, Officer Mitchell watched the scene unfold with growing concern. He had witnessed many family disagreements over the years, understanding that even royals experience conflict. But something about this interaction troubled him. The body language, the escalating tension, the way Camilla seemed to be losing control of her emotions. He reached for his radio, alerting his colleagues stationed near that corridor. The footage showed Camilla's hand rising, her finger pointing directly at Catherine's face as she made a particularly emphatic statement. Catherine's expression remained neutral, but her eyes showed a flicker of something, perhaps hurt or surprise at the intensity of the accusation. She tried once more to suggest they move this conversation elsewhere, her voice steady despite the situation. What happened next would become the focus of intense scrutiny. Camilla's composure, already strained, seemed to crack completely. The careful mask that royals wore in public slipped away, revealing raw emotion underneath. Her voice echoed off the stone walls, words tumbling out in a rush of pent-up frustration and resentment. She spoke of feeling overshadowed, of working tirelessly only to see headlines praise Catherine instead. Catherine's response was quiet but firm. She reminded Camilla that she had never sought to compete or diminish anyone's contributions. She spoke of her respect for the institution and for every member of the family, regardless of personal feelings. Her words were carefully chosen, diplomatic yet honest, but they seemed to fuel rather than calm the situation. The queen consort's hands clenched into fists at her sides, her face flushed with anger as she continued her tirade. She brought up specific incidents, moments Catherine had barely remembered, interpreting them as deliberate slights or calculated moves. The accusations painted a picture of paranoia and insecurity that had been hidden beneath years of public appearances and practiced smiles. Catherine could see that reason was not going to prevail in this moment. She made a decision to end the encounter, politely but firmly stating that she needed to attend to other responsibilities. She took another step back, preparing to walk past Camilla and continue down the corridor. It was a strategic retreat, recognizing that sometimes the best response to conflict is to remove oneself from the situation. But as Catherine moved to pass, Camilla's hand shot out. The gesture was swift and unexpected, reaching toward Catherine's arm as if to physically prevent her from leaving. This moment, captured clearly by the security camera, would become the most controversial part of the entire encounter. The intention behind the gesture remained ambiguous. Was it an attempt to keep Catherine there to continue the conversation, or was it something more aggressive? Officer Mitchell's colleague, Officer Sarah Chen, had already started moving toward the corridor when she received the radio call. She had been stationed near the library, just 2 rooms away from where the confrontation was taking place. Sarah had worked palace security for 8 years and had developed an instinct for when situations might turn serious. The urgency in Mitchell's voice told her this was one of those times. Sarah rounded the corner just as Camilla's hand reached toward Catherine. The Princess of Wales had instinctively pulled back, creating distance between herself and the queen consort. The officer quickly assessed the scene, her training allowing her to read the tension in both women's postures. Catherine's face showed relief at seeing security arrive, while Camilla seemed momentarily frozen. Perhaps realizing how far the situation had escalated, The security officer's presence changed everything. Camilla's hand dropped to her side, and her expression shifted from anger to something more complicated, a mixture of embarrassment and defiance. She seemed to suddenly become aware of where she was and what she had been doing. The ancient corridor, with its watching portraits and historical significance, was not the place for such a loss of control. Yet the damage, if that's what it could be called, had already been done. Officer Chen approached with professional courtesy, addressing both women with the respect their positions demanded. She asked if everything was all right, though it was clear from the atmosphere that it was not. Catherine responded first, her voice remarkably steady, considering what had just transpired. She assured the officer that she was fine and thanked her for her concern. The princess's composure was impressive. Showing no sign of the emotional impact the confrontation must have had, Camilla said nothing at first. She looked at Catherine, then at the security officer, finally down at her own hands, as if surprised by what they had nearly done. When she finally spoke, her words were clipped and formal. She stated that there had been a misunderstanding, that emotions had run high, but that everything was now resolved. The explanation felt hollow, especially given what the security cameras had recorded. Catherine took the opportunity to excuse herself. She thanked Officer Chen again and walked away with measured steps, neither rushing nor dawdling. Her posture remained perfect, her head held high, giving no indication to anyone who might see her that anything unusual had occurred. It was a masterclass in royal deportment, the ability to maintain dignity regardless of circumstances. Only those who knew her well might have noticed the slight tension in her shoulders or the way her hands gripped her folder a bit tighter than usual. After Catherine left, Officer Chen remained with Camilla. The protocol in such situations was unclear because nothing quite like this had happened before, at least not in Chen's experience. The queen consort was still a member of the royal family, still someone who outranked every security officer in the building. Yet Chen had witnessed behavior that raised concerns. Her duty was to protect all members of the royal household. Camilla seemed to gather herself, taking a deep breath and straightening her jacket. She looked at Officer Chen with an expression that was difficult to read. There was defiance there, certainly, but also perhaps a hint of vulnerability. She stated that she was perfectly fine and that her schedule was waiting. Without another word, she walked away in the opposite direction Catherine had gone. Her heels clicking sharply against the stone floor, Officer Chen immediately radioed back to Mitchell, confirming that the situation had been contained, but that he needed to review the footage carefully. She also noted that both parties had left the scene and appeared physically unharmed. However, her report included concerns about the emotional intensity of the encounter and the potential need for follow-up with senior palace officials. In the security room, Mitchell was already reviewing the recorded footage. He watched the entire sequence multiple times, noting timestamps and specific moments that seemed most significant. The quality of the video was excellent, showing facial expressions and body language clearly. There was no ambiguity about what had transpired. The conversation had been heated. Camilla had become increasingly agitated, and the physical gesture toward Catherine had crossed a line. The question now was what to do with this information. Security footage from the palace was typically treated as highly confidential, reviewed only when investigating specific incidents or security breaches. The content was meant to protect the royal family, not expose their private moments. Yet this situation felt different. It involved potential conflict between two senior members of the family, and there had been a moment where physical contact seemed imminent. Mitchell contacted his supervisor, Chief Security Officer David Thompson, who had been with the royal household for over 20 years. Thompson arrived at the security room within minutes, his face serious as he understood the gravity of what Mitchell was reporting. Together, they watched the footage again, discussing each moment and its implications. Thompson knew that this recording could never be allowed to leak to the public. The damage to the royal family's reputation would be immeasurable. The press would have a field day with footage showing conflict between Camilla and Catherine, two women whose relationship was already the subject of constant speculation. Yet the footage existed, and protocols required that certain people be informed about significant incidents involving royal family members. The chief security officer made several phone calls that afternoon, He spoke with the king's private secretary, carefully explaining what had occurred without unnecessary detail. He emphasized that no one had been physically harmed and that the situation had been resolved quickly. However, he also made clear that the incident had been serious enough to warrant official documentation. Catherine, meanwhile, had returned to her private office in another part of the palace. She sat alone for several minutes, allowing herself a moment to process what had happened. The facade she maintained so carefully in public could be relaxed here, in this quiet space where only her most trusted staff had access. She thought about the accusations Camilla had made, the pain and frustration evident in the older woman's voice. Despite everything, Catherine felt a pang of sympathy. She understood the pressure they were all under, the constant scrutiny, the impossible standards. The public expected them to be perfect, to never show strain or weakness. But they were human, and humans had breaking points. Camilla had clearly reached hers, at least temporarily. Catherine knew she should report the incident through proper channels. But she hesitated, not wanting to escalate matters further. Her private secretary, Amanda, knocked softly and entered when Catherine called out. Amanda had been with her for years and could read her moods better than almost anyone. She immediately sensed something was wrong. Catherine briefly explained what had occurred, keeping her description factual and unemotional. Amanda listened with growing concern, asking several times if Catherine was truly all right. Catherine assured her that she was fine, physically at least. Emotionally, she admitted to feeling shaken. The confrontation had been so unexpected, so unlike the usual interactions between family members. Even when there was tension or disagreement, it was typically expressed through carefully worded statements or subtle gestures, never an open conflict. This had been raw and unfiltered. Giving Catherine a glimpse of feelings she hadn't known existed, Amanda suggested that Catherine speak with Prince William. But Catherine shook her head. She didn't want to involve him unless absolutely necessary. William had his own relationship with his father and stepmother, and she didn't want to put him in a difficult position. Besides, she hoped that the incident could be addressed quietly, through proper channels, without creating family drama. But news of the confrontation was already spreading through the palace staff. Officer Chen had mentioned it to a colleague, who mentioned it to another. And soon whispers were circulating about a heated exchange between the Queen Consort and the Princess of Wales. The details grew more dramatic with each retelling, as often happens with gossip. Some versions had Camilla shouting loud enough to be heard throughout the wing. Others suggested Catherine had responded in kind, though this was entirely false. By late afternoon, several members of the royal household had heard some version of events. The king's private secretary decided he needed to brief the king himself, though he dreaded the conversation. King Charles had worked so hard to bring stability to the family, to present a united front after years of public difficulties. News of conflict between his wife and daughter-in-law would be deeply troubling to him. The briefing took place in the king's study, a room filled with personal touches that reflected his interests in architecture, gardening, and environmental causes. The king listened to the report with a grave expression, his fingers steepled under his chin. He asked several questions about the specifics of what had occurred and who else knew about it. When told about the security footage, he closed his eyes briefly, understanding the implications. King Charles had always been protective of Camilla, knowing how much criticism she had endured over the years. He also genuinely cared for Catherine and admired her dedication to the family. The thought of them in conflict pained him deeply. He asked his secretary to arrange separate private meetings with both women the following day. He wanted to hear their perspectives directly and find a way to resolve this before it became a larger problem. That evening, Catherine returned to her residence and finally told William what had happened. They sat together in their private sitting room while the children were occupied with homework and activities. William's reaction was immediate anger, not at Catherine, but at the situation. He wanted to confront his stepmother immediately, but Catherine urged caution. She explained her theory that Camilla had been under tremendous stress and had simply reached a breaking point. William struggled to accept this explanation. He had always been fiercely protective of Catherine, especially after watching his mother navigate the difficulties of royal life. The idea that someone had confronted his wife so aggressively made him want to take immediate action, But he also respected Catherine's judgment and her desire to handle the situation with grace rather than escalation. They discussed the security footage and what it might show. William was concerned about who would have access to it and whether there was any possibility of it being leaked. Catherine shared his concern, but felt there was little they could do except trust that security protocols would be followed. The footage existed, and that couldn't be changed. But hopefully it would remain in secure hands. The next morning arrived with heavy clouds hanging over Windsor Castle, matching the somber mood that had settled over certain parts of the household. Catherine woke early, having slept poorly despite her exhaustion. Her mind had replayed the confrontation repeatedly, analyzing each word and gesture, wondering what she might have done differently. She knew logically that she bore no blame for what had occurred, but the questions persisted anyway. She dressed carefully for the day ahead, knowing that her meeting with the king would require both emotional strength and diplomatic skill. She chose a simple but elegant dress in a soft gray color. Wanting to appear respectful and serious without seeming defensive or combative, her hair was pulled back in her signature style, and she wore minimal jewelry. The goal was to project calm professionalism. The king's private secretary had scheduled Catherine's meeting for 10 o'clock in the morning. As she walked through the palace corridors toward the king's study, she noticed staff members averting their eyes more than usual. The gossip had clearly spread, though likely in distorted forms. She held her head high, refusing to show any sign of discomfort or embarrassment. If the staff wanted drama, they wouldn't get it from her. King Charles greeted Catherine warmly when she entered his study. Gesturing for her to sit in one of the comfortable chairs near the fireplace, he looked tired, as though he also had not slept well. His concern for both women in this situation was evident in the lines around his eyes and the careful way he chose his opening words. He thanked Catherine for coming and assured her that this conversation would remain completely confidential. Catherine appreciated his kindness as she began recounting the events of the previous day. She spoke calmly and factually, describing the confrontation without embellishment or emotional color. She explained that she had been leaving her meeting when she encountered Camilla in the corridor. The queen consort had seemed upset, and that the conversation had escalated quickly, despite Catherine's attempts to de-escalate it. The king listened without interrupting, his expression growing more troubled as the story unfolded. When Catherine reached the part about Camilla's hand reaching toward her, he winced visibly. He asked whether Catherine felt threatened or unsafe, and she considered the question carefully before answering. She admitted that she had been startled and uncomfortable, but that officer, just his arrival, had prevented the situation from progressing further. King Charles asked what Catherine wanted to happen next. This question surprised her. She had expected to be told what would happen, not asked for her input. She thought for a moment before responding that she hoped for understanding and resolution rather than punishment or further conflict. She acknowledged that royal life placed enormous pressure on everyone and that she believed Camilla had reached a difficult moment. She suggested that perhaps they all needed better support systems for managing stress. The king seemed both relieved and impressed by Catherine's mature response. He shared that he would be speaking with Camilla later that day and that he hoped to facilitate a conversation between the two women at some point. He emphasized that such conflict between family members was unacceptable and could not happen again. But he also expressed his desire to address underlying issues rather than simply imposing consequences. Catherine left the meeting feeling somewhat better. The king had listened to her perspective and treated her concerns seriously. She felt supported by him, which mattered more than she had realized. As she walked back through the corridors, she allowed herself to hope that perhaps this incident could lead to better understanding between everyone in the family. Camilla's meeting with the king was scheduled for 2 o'clock that afternoon. She arrived precisely on time, her expression carefully neutral. Unlike Catherine, she appeared to have slept well, or at least had successfully hidden any signs of a difficult night. She wore an elegant suit in deep burgundy, and her makeup was flawless. She projected confidence and composure, though whether that was genuine or a carefully constructed facade remained unclear. The king greeted his wife with his usual affection. but his tone was more serious than normal when they sat down to talk. He began by stating that he had spoken with Catherine that morning and had reviewed security reports about the incident. He wanted to hear Camilla's account of what had happened and understand what had led to such an uncharacteristic loss of control. Camilla's version of events differed from Catherine's in subtle but significant ways. She acknowledged that she had been upset and that the conversation had been intense, but she characterized it as a frank discussion about family dynamics rather than a confrontation. She claimed that Catherine had misunderstood her tone and intentions, that the reaching gesture had been an attempt to emphasize a point rather than anything aggressive. The king listened, but gently challenged some of her characterizations. He mentioned the security footage which had captured the incident from multiple angles. He explained that what the cameras showed seemed to contradict some of her descriptions. Camilla's composure slipped slightly at this news. She had apparently not realized that the encounter had been recorded, or perhaps had hoped the footage would not be reviewed. Faced with video evidence, Camilla shifted her approach. She admitted that she had been under significant stress and that she might have expressed herself more forcefully than intended. She talked about feeling constantly compared to Catherine, about reading endless articles praising the younger woman while criticizing her own contributions. She spoke about the impossible position of being the second wife, always living in the shadow of a beloved first wife, and now feeling overshadowed by the next generation as well. The king listened with sympathy, understanding that much of what his wife described was true. The public had indeed been harsh on Camilla for years, and the favorable coverage of Catherine must have been difficult to witness constantly. But he also made clear that these frustrations, however valid, did not excuse inappropriate behavior toward another family member. Catherine had done nothing to deserve such treatment. Camilla acknowledged this point reluctantly. She admitted that Catherine personally had always been respectful and kind. The issue was not really with Catherine as an individual, but with what she represented: the youth and freshness that naturally attracted positive attention. Camilla recognized the irony that she had once been the young woman entering a complex family situation, though circumstances had been very different then. The king proposed several steps forward. First, Camilla would need to apologize to Catherine directly and sincerely. Second, they would arrange for regular private meetings between the two women to improve communication and prevent future misunderstandings. Third, the king would speak with senior palace officials about better stress management resources for all family members. The pressures they faced were unique, and they needed appropriate support. Camilla agreed to these conditions, though her agreement seemed more dutiful than enthusiastic. She asked about the security footage and whether it would be destroyed. The king explained that he could not order its destruction, as security protocols required retention of such material. However, he would ensure it remained in secure hands and that access was strictly limited to only the most senior security personnel and himself. This answer did not entirely satisfy Camilla, but she recognized there was little she could do about it. The footage existed, and she would have to live with that reality. She could only hope that it would never be seen beyond the small circle who already knew about it. The thought of such a moment being viewed by others, let alone becoming public, filled her with dread. Over the next few days, arrangements were made for Camilla and Catherine to meet privately. The location chosen was a small sitting room in a quiet part of Windsor Castle, as far from the main corridors where staff frequently passed. The room was comfortable, but not formal, with soft lighting and comfortable chairs positioned to facilitate conversation rather than confrontation. Catherine arrived first, sitting down and taking a few deep breaths to center herself. She reminded herself of her goals for this conversation: to listen, to be honest about her experience, and to move toward resolution. She did not want to carry resentment or create lasting division within the family. Life was too short and their shared responsibilities too important. When Camilla entered, there was a moment of awkward silence as both women assessed the other. Catherine stood and greeted her with a polite smile, gesturing to the chairs. They sat down, and for several seconds, neither spoke. Finally, Camilla broke the silence with an apology. It was not effusive or overly emotional, but it seemed genuine. She admitted that she had behaved inappropriately and that Catherine had not deserved such treatment. Catherine accepted the apology with grace. She thanked Camilla for acknowledging what had happened and expressed her hope that they could move forward positively. She also took the opportunity to address some of Camilla's concerns directly. She explained that she had never sought to compete with anyone and that she had enormous respect for the work Camilla had done over the years. The conversation that followed was more honest than any they had previously shared. Both women spoke about the pressures they felt, the constant judgment, the impossible standards. They discovered unexpected common ground in their shared experiences, though they had approached their roles from very different starting points. Camilla had spent years being vilified, while Catherine had been placed on an unrealistic pedestal. Both positions were difficult in different ways. They talked for over an hour, covering topics they had never discussed before. Camilla shared insights about navigating the press and managing public perception that Catherine found valuable. Catherine talked about the challenges of raising children in the royal spotlight and trying to give them normal experiences. Despite their extraordinary circumstances, they found that when they stopped seeing each other as rivals or threats, actual connection became possible. By the end of the meeting, both women felt lighter. The tension that had existed between them, sometimes acknowledged but often ignored, had been addressed directly. They agreed to meet regularly for private conversations. Recognizing that better communication could prevent future misunderstandings, they also agreed that what had happened would stay between them, the king and the few security personnel who already knew. As Catherine left that meeting, she felt genuine optimism. The confrontation, as unpleasant as it had been, might ultimately lead to a stronger relationship. Sometimes conflicts brought issues to the surface that needed to be addressed. Sometimes temporary discomfort led to long-term improvement. She hoped this would be one of those cases. Officer Mitchell and Chief Thompson had a quiet conversation about the security footage later that week. They agreed that the recording would be archived in the most secure system available, with access restricted to only 3 people, themselves and the king. The footage would never be destroyed. As protocols required permanent retention of security materials, but every possible safeguard would be put in place to prevent unauthorized viewing or copying. Both men understood the gravity of what they were protecting. In the wrong hands, this footage could cause enormous damage to the royal family and potentially to the institution of the monarchy itself. The fact that it showed conflict between 2 senior royals, with one appearing to lose control, would be sensational news. The press would analyze every frame, experts would offer opinions, and public perception could shift dramatically. 3 months passed after the corridor incident, and life within the palace walls had settled into a new rhythm. Catherine and Camilla maintained their agreement to meet regularly, and these conversations had gradually become less awkward and more genuine. They would never be close friends. Their personalities and approaches to royal life were too different for that. But they had achieved a working relationship, built on mutual respect rather than unspoken tension. The security footage remained locked away, known only to a handful of people who had signed strict confidentiality agreements. Mitchell checked the access logs regularly, confirming that no unauthorized attempts had been made to view the material. The digital file sat in encrypted storage, a secret that everyone involved hoped would remain buried forever. They understood that the stability of the royal family sometimes depended on what remained private rather than what was revealed. Catherine had thrown herself into her charity work with renewed energy. The confrontation had reminded her of her own vulnerability and had deepened her empathy for others facing difficult circumstances. She expanded her mental health initiatives, recognizing that everyone, regardless of status or position, needed support during challenging times. Her public appearances showed no hint of the private struggles she had experienced, testament to her ability to compartmentalize and focus on her responsibilities. Camilla, for her part, had taken steps to manage her stress more effectively. She had begun working with a private counselor, something she had resisted for years due to concerns about confidentiality and the stigma she imagined would come with seeking help. The king had encouraged this decision, and Camilla had reluctantly admitted it was beneficial. She learned techniques for managing her frustration and for putting media coverage into perspective. The relationship between William and his stepmother had been strained after the incident. He had struggled to forgive what he saw as an attack on his wife, even though Catherine had asked him to let it go. Eventually, a carefully orchestrated conversation between William and Camilla, facilitated by the king, had helped clear the air. William had expressed his concerns directly, but respectfully, and Camilla had offered him the same apology she had given Catherine. The palace staff had eventually moved on to other gossip, as staff always did. The incident became old news, replaced by fresher rumors about upcoming engagements, royal visits, and the usual speculation about family dynamics. Those who had heard about the confrontation remembered it, but without new details or developments, interest faded. The official silence from all parties confirmed that nothing further would be said on the matter. However, not everyone had forgotten. A young palace employee named Thomas Brennan had heard about the incident through the staff grapevine. Thomas worked in the IT department, responsible for maintaining computer systems and digital infrastructure throughout the palace. He had been with the household for only 2 years, and unlike the longtime staff members, he had not yet developed the deep loyalty and discretion that typically characterized palace employees. Thomas was ambitious and often felt underappreciated in his role. He saw himself as more talented than his position reflected, and he resented the hierarchy that seemed to keep him from advancing. When he heard whispers about explosive footage showing conflict between royals, his interest was immediately piqued. He began asking casual questions of colleagues, piecing together details about what had happened and, more importantly, where the footage might be stored. His inquiries were subtle enough that no one suspected his intentions. He framed his questions as idle curiosity, the kind of gossip that everyone engaged in occasionally. But internally, Thomas was forming a plan. He knew that such footage, if it existed and if he could access it, would be valuable. Media outlets would pay enormous sums for authentic videos showing genuine conflict within the royal family. The money could change his life, allow him to leave his current position and start fresh. Somewhere else, Thomas began researching the palace security systems. Using his legitimate access to IT infrastructure as cover, he studied the encryption methods, the backup systems, the access logs. He was careful not to leave obvious traces of his investigation, knowing that security personnel would notice anything overtly suspicious. He told himself he was just exploring possibilities, not yet committed to actually stealing the footage. Officer Mitchell, despite his vigilance, did not immediately notice the subtle digital probing. Thomas was skilled enough to make his activities look like routine maintenance and system checks. The IT employee took his time, spending weeks mapping out the security architecture and identifying potential vulnerabilities. He discovered that while the main storage system was heavily protected, the backup protocols had weaknesses he might be able to exploit. The ethical implications of what he was considering troubled Thomas, but he rationalized his intentions. He told himself the public had a right to know what really happened within the palace walls. That transparency was important even for royal families. He convinced himself that he would be exposing hypocrisy rather than invading privacy. These justifications helped quiet his conscience, though deep down he knew his primary motivation was financial gain. In early summer, Thomas decided to attempt accessing the footage. He chose a Friday afternoon when many staff members left early and the palace was quieter than usual. He logged into the security backup system using credentials he had carefully obtained through social engineering and patient observation. His heart raced as he navigated through layers of encrypted folders, searching for anything related to the incident date. Finding the specific file took longer than he anticipated. The archive was vast, containing months of footage from dozens of cameras throughout the palace. He searched by date and location, narrowing down possibilities until he found a folder that matched his information. Inside were multiple video files, each labeled with camera numbers and timestamps. His hands trembled slightly as he began downloading several files to a secure external drive. What Thomas did not know was that his access attempt had triggered multiple silent alarms. The security system was more sophisticated than he realized, with monitoring protocols that flagged unusual access patterns even when using legitimate credentials. Within minutes, Mitchell received an alert on his phone about unauthorized activity in the secure archive. He immediately contacted Chief Thompson and rushed to the security control room, They pulled up logs showing exactly what Thomas was accessing and from which terminal. The IT department computer he was using was quickly identified, and security cameras showed Thomas sitting at his desk, focused intently on his screen. Thompson made a quick decision and dispatched 2 officers to the IT department immediately. They needed to stop this breach before any files could be transferred outside Palace systems. Thomas was so focused on his download progress that he did not hear the officers approaching until they were standing beside his desk. He looked up in shock, his face draining of color as he realized he had been caught. One officer calmly asked him to step away from the computer while the other secured the external drive. That was still connected. Thomas tried to stammer an explanation, but no words came out that made sense. He was escorted to a secure room where Chief Thompson and Mitchell waited to question him. The gravity of what he had attempted was explained in clear terms. He had violated multiple security protocols, broken confidentiality agreements, and attempted to steal highly sensitive material. The potential consequences included criminal charges, not just termination of employment. Thomas began to understand how seriously he had miscalculated. Under questioning, Thomas admitted his intentions. He confessed that he had planned to sell the footage to media outlets, though he had not yet contacted any buyers. He provided details about how he had gained access and what files he had attempted to download. His cooperation was complete, perhaps hoping it would lead to leniency, though he was told no promises could be made. The investigation revealed that Thomas had successfully downloaded 3 video files before being stopped. Fortunately, the external drive had been secured immediately, and forensic analysis confirmed that no copies had been made or transmitted elsewhere. The files were deleted from the drive, and the device was secured as evidence. The breach had been contained, but it exposed vulnerabilities in the security system that needed immediate attention. The king was informed of the breach that same evening. His reaction was one of deep concern rather than anger. He understood that the existence of the footage created permanent risk, that as long as it existed, someone might try to access it. He asked whether the footage could now be destroyed, given the security concerns it created. Chief Thompson explained that, while he understood the desire, destroying it would violate established protocols and might raise more questions than it answered. Instead, additional security measures were implemented. Access to that section of the archive was restricted to only 2 people, with any access attempt requiring dual authorization and real-time monitoring. The encryption was upgraded. The physical servers storing the material were moved to a more secure location within the palace complex. Every possible safeguard was put in place to prevent another breach attempt. Thomas Brennan was terminated immediately and faced criminal prosecution for his actions. The case was handled quietly, without media attention, as drawing attention to the prosecution would inevitably lead to questions about what he had been trying to steal. He accepted a plea agreement that included a significant prison sentence and ironclad confidentiality agreements. His attempt to profit from palace secrets had instead destroyed his career and freedom. The incident prompted a broader review of palace security and employee vetting procedures. Background checks were strengthened, and new protocols were implemented for monitoring access to sensitive systems. All employees with access to digital archives were required to undergo additional training on confidentiality and the severe consequences of breaching it. The goal was to prevent any future attempts while maintaining the trust necessary for the palace to function. Catherine and Camilla were both informed about the breach attempt and the measures taken to prevent future incidents. Catherine was troubled by how close the footage had come to being stolen, but she took comfort in knowing that the system had ultimately worked. The breach had been detected and stopped before any damage was done. She tried not to think about what might have happened if Thomas had been more skilled or the security systems less robust. Camilla's reaction was more emotional. The idea that someone had tried to steal and sell footage of her worst moment filled her with renewed anxiety. She had worked so hard to move past that incident, to repair relationships and manage her stress better. The knowledge that video evidence existed and would always exist felt like a sword hanging over her head. She asked again whether it could be destroyed, and again was told it could not be. The king organized a private family meeting to discuss the situation. He gathered William, Catherine, and Camilla to talk about the footage, the breach attempt, and what it meant going forward. He acknowledged that the existence of the recording created an ongoing risk, but emphasized that every possible protection was now in place. He asked that they all trust in the security measures and focus on moving forward rather than dwelling on what had happened. William spoke up during this meeting, suggesting that perhaps the incident itself had ultimately been valuable, despite its difficulty. It had brought tensions to the surface that needed addressing. It improved communication between Catherine and Camilla, and had led to better support systems for everyone. If that difficult day in the corridor had led to positive changes, then perhaps it had served a purpose, even if an unpleasant one. Catherine agreed with this perspective. She noted that her relationship with Camilla was now stronger than it had been before the incident. They understood each other better and had learned to communicate more openly. The confrontation, as unpleasant as it was to remember, had been a catalyst for growth. Sometimes the most difficult moments led to the most important changes. Camilla listened to these perspectives and gradually acknowledged their truth. She had learned about herself through that experience, about her stress limits and her need for better support systems. She had learned about the importance of addressing issues directly rather than letting them fester. And she had learned that mistakes, even serious ones, did not have to define a person if they were willing to acknowledge them and make amends. The meeting concluded with a renewed commitment from everyone to support each other and maintain the improved relationships they had built. The king expressed his pride in how everyone had handled a difficult situation with maturity and grace. He acknowledged that royal life would always present challenges, but he felt confident that they could face them together as a family. In the months and years that followed, the corridor incident became a private turning point for those involved. It was never discussed publicly and remained unknown to the world beyond the palace walls. Catherine and Camilla continued their regular meetings, finding value in the honest conversations they shared. The security footage remained locked away, its existence known but its contents never viewed, except by the few who had seen it initially. Officer Mitchell eventually retired from palace service, having served with distinction for over 20 years. Before he left, he ensured that the next generation of security personnel understood the importance of discretion and the weight of the secrets they protected. He never spoke publicly about what he had witnessed that day in the corridor, taking his knowledge with him into retirement. The palace continued its work, presenting a unified face to the public while managing the complex human dynamics that existed behind closed doors. The royal family learned that perfection was impossible, that conflict was sometimes inevitable, but that how they responded to difficulties mattered more than the difficulties themselves. They learned that protecting each other sometimes meant protecting secrets, and that discretion was not the same as dishonesty. Years later, when historians would study this period of royal history, they would note the strengthened relationships and improved protocols without ever knowing about the incident that had prompted them. Some secrets, it seemed, could remain secret after all. The footage existed in its secure archive, a reminder of human fallibility and the importance of safeguards, but it never saw the light of day. And perhaps that was how it should be, a moment of weakness contained and learned from, but not exploited or sensationalized. The lesson, if there was one, was that even the most privileged and public lives contained private struggles. That behind the ceremonies and official appearances, real people dealt with real emotions and real conflicts. And that sometimes the greatest strength was not in being perfect, but in acknowledging imperfection and choosing to grow from it. The hidden palace footage remained hidden, its explosive moment preserved but private, a secret that ultimately protected not just individuals, but the institution they all served.
Thanks for watching. Don't forget to be subscribed.